All right, so are you ready to have your mind blown? Today, we are diving deep into Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind.
Sounds ambitious. The entire history of humanity, eh?
That's right. And Harari does a fantastic job of breaking it down, focusing on these three revolutions that totally reshaped us: the cognitive, the agricultural, and the scientific.
A trilogy of revolutions.
It is. But before we even get to those, we got to rewind all the way back, right?
Yeah.
To the very beginning. You know, humans have been walking the earth for like 2.5 million years.
That is a long time.
But get this, history as we know it, that only started about 70,000 years ago.
That is a big gap. What happened?
Well, Harari calls that click, that moment, the cognitive revolution.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. What exactly does that mean? What made it so special?
Basically, he says that the key to this revolution was our ability to talk about things that don't really exist. Like, we started sharing stories, myths, ideas, creating what he calls imagined realities.
Ah, I see. So like nations, corporations, even money.
Exactly. Isn't it wild when you really think about it? We all just kind of agree that this paper, this money, has value.
Yeah. If you think about it, it only has power because collectively we say it does, right?
Right. And the same goes for things like laws, religions, and social structures, right? It all exists because we imagine it into being.
We are creatures of imagination then. Not just social creatures, which other animals are too, of course.
Exactly. And that, he says, that's what sets us apart, our shared imagination. It's what let us work together, build these huge societies, and ultimately, change the whole planet.
Fascinating.
So the cognitive revolution, that sets the stage, right? We're communicating, we're imagining, our brains are growing. But hold on, before we get to farms and cities, there's this really cool tangent Harari goes on about the impact of cooked food.
Cooked food. I admit, never thought of that as like a revolutionary act.
I know, right? But consider this. Chimps spend 5 hours a day chewing on raw food, but we humans, we get all those same calories in just 1 hour because we cook our food.
Wow. 5 hours versus 1 hour. What could our ancestors do with all that extra time?
I mean, think about it. What could you do with an extra 4 hours every day?
So much.
So we've got all this free time, energy. What else did cooking do for us?
Well, cooking also let us eat all kinds of new things we couldn't have before. It expanded our diet. Harari actually says that it even led to shorter intestines, which in turn gave us even more energy for our brains.
Ooh.
Yeah, you could actually say that cooking fueled the development of human intelligence.
That's wild. Do you think that played a part in Neanderthals having bigger brains than their ancestors too?
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? It makes you realize just how connected these simple actions like cooking can be to huge evolutionary shifts.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've mastered fire, we're sharing stories, bellies are full, brains are buzzing, and then bam, we enter the agricultural revolution.
Farming.
But here's where Harari throws us for a loop, right? We always think of farming as this big leap forward. But he argues that it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Interesting. So it wasn't just a straight line of progress.
Not exactly. Sure, it let us build bigger populations, settlements, and of course eventually cities and entire civilizations. But all of that came at a price. What were the downsides?
Well, for one, farming is hard work. I mean, really hard. Hunter-gatherers, even though they had to, worry about finding food, they also had more free time. And they ate way more diversely. Farmers, they were tied to the land, working all the time to grow their crops, and they ended up eating a lot less variety, too.
So basically, we traded variety and flexibility for stability. But was it a good trade?
It's hard to say, right? That's kind of the question Harari wants us to think about. He calls it the luxury trap. Basically, something that starts out as a luxury, say a surplus of food, ends up becoming something we need. We become dependent on it, so we end up working even harder just to keep up that new standard of living.
So our desire for comfort, security, it can trap us.
It can.
Yeah.
And we see this pattern all over history, even today in the modern world. Think about how much of your time you spend working just so you can afford things that used to be luxuries.
That is sobering when you put it like that. So we traded foraging for farming and, in a way, lost freedom and flexibility, but I guess we gained something too, right? Like the ability to have larger populations.
Oh, absolutely. The agricultural revolution was massive, but it's important to remember that it wasn't a clear upgrade. There were benefits, but there were definitely costs too, costs that we are still dealing with today.
Now that you mention it, I am seeing this luxury trap everywhere I look. Okay, but before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's stick with the past a little longer. Harari talks about another big consequence of the cognitive revolution, and this one's not pretty. megafauna extinction.
Ah, yes. We tend to think of our impact on the planet as pretty recent, but there's actually evidence that our early ancestors were messing things up a long time ago.
And by messing things up, you mean wiping out giant sloths and woolly mammoths?
Well, there are some pretty dramatic examples. But yeah, in places like Australia and the Americas, when humans arrived, the megafauna disappeared. It's hard to ignore that.
We're talking about giant kangaroos and marsupial lions, creatures that sound like they're straight out of a fantasy novel. What happened? Did we hunt them all?
It was probably a mix of things, hunting, disrupting their habitats, maybe even bringing new diseases with us. Whatever the reason, it's definitely a reminder that humans have been shaping the planet for a long time, and not always in a good way.
It's a little unsettling when you think about it. Okay, so from megafauna extinction, we go to empires, money, and religion. Seems like a big jump, but Harari argues that these three things were key in unifying humanity.
And it all goes back to our ability to believe those imagined realities we were talking about. Empires imposed a shared political order, money made trading easier, and religion. Well, religion gave people a shared belief system that crossed borders and cultures.
I'm starting to see how it all connects now. But can you give me some real-world examples? Like, how did these imagined realities actually play out?
Well, take the Code of Hammurabi. It's one of the oldest legal codes we know of, right? And it reflects a very specific idea of justice hierarchical, very much an eye for an eye. Now, compare that to something like the American Declaration of Independence, where it's all about equality and individual rights.
Two very different visions of justice.
Exactly. But both are based on imagined realities.
It's kind of wild to think that something as fundamental as justice is a human invention, right? Like, it's just a story we tell ourselves about how things should work.
It is, isn't it? And it's the same with money. It's essentially a shared hallucination. But because we all believe in it, it shapes our lives in massive ways.
I think I need to take a minute to wrap my head around that one.
Mm.
But how did we even get to the point where we could imagine such complex systems? It feels like there must have been another big shift in how we think and communicate.
You're right. And that leads us to another massive development that Harari talks about, the invention of writing.
Ah, yes. The power of script. Hard to imagine a world without it.
Absolutely. It started as a way to keep track of information, taxes, lists, things like that. But it quickly became something much bigger.
We started writing down stories, histories, philosophies. It must have changed everything.
Imagine, before writing, all that knowledge just existed in people's heads. It was passed down through stories, but that's it. Writing made it permanent and way easier to spread. It's no coincidence that empires and large-scale civilizations really took off after writing was invented.
It's like our brains just expanded outwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Writing became like a backup for our memories. And suddenly we had access to centuries worth of knowledge from people we'd never even met.
Exactly. It opened up a whole new universe of information. And being able to record our thoughts and memories like that changed us. We started thinking differently, thinking bigger about the past and the future in ways we couldn't before.
Makes you wonder if we're still in the early stages of this whole writing revolution, right? Think about how much we use computers to store and access information today.
Good point. It's almost like writing has become even more powerful now.
So first we learned to write words, then we figured out numbers, and now those numbers are driving all our technology. Crazy how it all connects.
And that brings us to the final revolution in Harari's book, The Scientific Revolution.
No, this should be good.
But we will save that conversation for part 2 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned. Welcome back. Last time we were exploring how humans went from, insignificant apes to, rulers of the planet, all thanks to the cognitive and agricultural revolutions.
It's an incredible story when you think about it.
It really is. And we left off right as things were about to get really interesting with the scientific revolution, especially relevant these days, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's a turning point that continues to shape the world we live in today.
So what is it about this scientific revolution that sets it apart? I mean, weren't ancient civilizations like the Greeks doing science too?
It's subtle, but important. See, pre-modern knowledge often relied on sacred texts, on the idea that ancient authorities knew best. The scientific revolution was different. It was all about acknowledging that we actually don't know everything.
So it was like a revolution of humility, admitting that even the smartest people don't have all the answers.
Exactly. It embraced uncertainty, questioned everything, and constantly sought new evidence.
So it wasn't just about gathering knowledge, it was a whole new way of looking at knowledge. What else made the scientific revolution so unique?
Harari really stresses observation and mathematics as, the foundation. Instead of just relying on old texts or pronouncements from authority figures, scientists started gathering data from the world around them, conducting experiments, and using math to analyze what they found.
So testing ideas against reality rather than just blindly accepting them, that's where the whole scientific method came from.
Exactly. And that simple shift in thinking led to some amazing discoveries, especially in the last few centuries.
Yeah, it's incredible how fast things change. We went from horse-drawn carriages to landing on the moon in a pretty short amount of time, really.
It's almost like history went into overdrive.
Yeah.
And that acceleration really is a key part of the scientific revolution. Think about it. Back in 1500, no human had ever sailed around the entire Earth.
Right.
When Magellan's expedition finally did it, it took them 3 years. And most of the crew died along the way.
Now you can hop on a plane and do it in less than 2 days. It's amazing how much our sense of time and distance has changed.
And it's not just travel. Think about the modern economy. Like today, a large bank holds more money than all the pre-modern kingdoms in the entire world combined.
It's mind-boggling. So it's not just about technology then, it's a totally different scale of human activity.
Exactly. And that leads to another key point about the scientific revolution. It's not just about understanding the world. It's about using that understanding to get more power.
Knowledge is power.
In a way, yeah. Think about the Industrial Revolution, which basically grew out of the scientific revolution. We invented the steam engine, which gave us a whole new source of energy and made us way more productive.
Right, and that led to factories, mass production, and eventually to globalization. But wasn't that also when new ideologies started popping up, like liberalism, socialism, communism?
Oh, definitely. The scientific revolution didn't just change stuff, it changed our ideas too. Our ideas about politics, society, even human nature.
So it's all connected then. Science gives us new power that leads to social and political changes, which then influence what kind of science gets done.
It's a cycle, a feedback loop, as they say.
Mm.
And that cycle is still shaping our world today.
You know, before we dive too deep into the complexities of the modern world, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the scientific revolution being about acquiring new powers. Can you give me a concrete example of that from history?
Sure. European dominance in the 19th and 20th centuries is a perfect example. Their scientific and technological advantage allowed them to build huge empires, exploit resources on a global scale, and, let's be honest, exert military dominance over other parts of the world. There's this chilling quote from a European soldier who was fighting in Africa. "Come what may, we have machine guns and they don't."
Wow. That really highlights how scientific knowledge can be turned into raw, brutal power.
Yeah. It's a sobering reminder that progress isn't always moral progress. And that brings us to another important development in the modern world, the rise of capitalism.
Ah, yes, capitalism. Harari has a very interesting take on capitalism, doesn't he? He calls it the most successful of the modern religions.
Right. It's a bold statement. But if you really think about it, capitalism does have a lot of things in common with religion. It has its own set of beliefs, values, even rituals. And of course, its own prophets, like Adam Smith.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me an example of a capitalist ritual.
Think about shopping. It's not just about getting things you need or want. It's about participating in this system of exchange that reinforces certain values and beliefs.
Like the belief that having more stuff makes you happier.
Definitely part of it. But there's also this deeper belief in the power of the free market. You know, the idea that if everyone just acts in their own self-interest, the market will magically take care of everything and everyone will benefit. That's the invisible hand idea.
Sure. But hasn't capitalism also caused some pretty serious problems, like massive inequality, damage to the environment, this focus on short-term profits instead of long-term sustainability?
Oh, absolutely. No system is perfect, and capitalism has its downsides, for sure. But Harari's point is that it's been incredibly successful at spreading its influence all over the world. It's shaped not just our economies, but our values, our dreams, everything.
It's almost like we all live in a world that's built on capitalism, whether we realize it or not.
It's a good way to put it. And that leads us to the big question. Where do we go from here? Is this the final chapter for humanity? Or is there another revolution on the horizon?
Those are some big questions, and I think we're ready to try and tackle them head on. But before we do, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back for the final part of our deep dive into Sapiens. Okay, we're back, ready for the final part of our deep dive into Sapiens.
Let's do it.
We've gone from the cognitive revolution to the rise of capitalism, but I'm really curious to see how all of this, what it means for us now in the 21st century.
It's the big question, isn't it? Where do we go from here?
Hmm.
Harari doesn't exactly have a crystal ball,
Yeah.
but he definitely gives us some things to think about, some really interesting challenges and opportunities that are coming our way.
One of the things that really stuck with me was this idea of like imagined realities. I get how things like money or nations are essentially made up, but Harari says even stuff like justice, even gender roles that's shaped by our beliefs.
Yeah, it's true. And it makes you realize that we have to really look at those basic assumptions that shape the world, right? Like, take the legal system. Laws, they aren't based on some kind of like natural order. We created them based on what we believe, on what we agree on.
So justice is basically a story we tell ourselves about what's right and wrong.
Pretty much. And that story can change. I mean, it has changed a lot over time, hasn't it? It reflects how our values change. Think about things like slavery or women's rights, things that seem totally normal in one era, but now we look back and they seem crazy.
It's a good reminder that we shouldn't assume our values are the right ones. They're just a product of our imaginations, right?
Right. And that goes for so many things. Like, think about gender roles. The idea that men and women are supposed to act certain ways, have certain jobs, that's not really based on biology. It's a social construct.
Okay, I see what you mean. What we consider normal for men and women is totally different depending on where you are in the world or even what time period you're in. But are you saying there are no biological differences between the sexes at all?
No, not at all. Of course there are biological differences. Harari's point is that the meanings we give to those differences, the roles we create around them, those are made up.
Whoa. Okay. This is making me see the world in a whole new way. We just take so much for granted as being real, but when you really stop and think about it, a lot of it is totally arbitrary.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's one of the best things about reading books like Sapiens. It forces us to question everything, to look at things from different perspectives.
Okay, so a lot of what we consider real is actually based on beliefs and social constructs. So where does that leave us? Does it mean that nothing is really objective or meaningful?
That's a tough question. Not sure I have a simple answer for you. But I don't think Harari's trying to say that these imagined realities don't matter. He wants us to understand how they work, how much power they have over us, how they can be good, but also dangerous.
Because even though they're not real in the same way that a mountain is real, they still have a huge impact on how we live our lives, how we think, how we relate to each other.
Right. And that leads us to maybe the biggest challenge we face today. How do we balance our individual freedom with, the need for a strong society? The scientific revolution, capitalism, they've given us more freedom and choices than ever before. But have we lost something along the way, like our sense of community and shared values?
It's like we're being pulled in opposite directions, right? On the one hand, you can travel the world, you can be whoever you want to be. On the other hand, it's easy to feel lost, alone in this crazy world.
You have the paradox, isn't it? We've gained so much, but also lost something. And figuring out how to create a sense of belonging and purpose in a world that's increasingly individualistic, it's a huge challenge.
That's a lot to take in. Does Harari, offer any solutions? How do we deal with all this?
Well, Harari's not giving us a step-by-step plan. He's more about making us think. But I think the most important thing we can take away from Sapiens is to think critically. Be aware of how our own minds work.
So question everything, understand what shapes our beliefs, and then make conscious choices about the kind of world we want.
That's it. And to do that, we have to learn from history, see the bigger picture of how humans have developed, and understand how powerful the stories we tell ourselves really are.
Because those stories, those imagined realities, they shape the world.
They absolutely do. And that's a pretty powerful idea to leave people with, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. The future isn't set in stone. We're the ones writing the next chapter,
Sure.
individually and as a species.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that was quite a journey, wasn't it? From the dawn of humanity to, well, who knows what the future holds. Sapiens is definitely a book that makes you think.
It does. It's challenging, but worth it. So, to all our listeners, if you're looking for a book that will make you see the world in a whole new light, challenge your assumptions, really dive deep into the human story, I highly recommend checking out Sapiens.
It's a journey, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And as Harari reminds us, the future is not just something that happens to us. We create it through the choices we make, the stories we tell.
So choose wisely and tell good stories.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Sapiens. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.